I don't believe there's somebody introducing the session, so I'll just tell you who I am. I'm Tom Beghin, and I work at the Orpheus Institute in Ghent, Belgium. With his 6 sonatas with varied reprises, Wolfgang 50, Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach embarked on a bold experiment. Mixing his identities as composer and performer, he was about to contribute to a practice that on the one hand he did not want to see too widespread, yet on the other aimed to raise to a higher level, namely that of the performer to vary repeats. The novelty in Bach's score lies in the fact that for its entire 34 pages, it contains not a single repeat sign. Instead, he writes out every repeat while applying to each the art of variation. In his preface, Bach proclaims himself, quote, "As far as I know, the first to have worked in this manner, auf diese Art." With this experimental opus of sonatas, did Bach also establish a new genre? And how might such a genre, worthy of being printed as Sonaten mit veränderten Reprisen, distinguish itself from a practice of varying repeats? As I started performing Mozart's Munich sonatas, Köchel 279 through 284, a project I took on because of their opus potential, I found myself contemplating the following letter by Leopold Mozart to Herr Breitkopf, famous bookseller in Leipzig of October 6th, 1775. As I've been determined for some time now to have something of my son's work printed, I'd ask you to let me know as soon as possible whether you might decide to publish something, whether it be symphonies, quartets, etc., or keyboard sonatas. Regarding the latter, the question may be whether you would like to print keyboard sonatas in the same manner as those by Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach mit veränderten Reprisen. Auf die Art, in the same manner, using the same wording as C.P. Bach in his preface, can be read in a double way. In reference to printing, that they require special formatting caused by lack of conventional repeat signs. Secondly, that if Breitkopf were to accept Leopold's offer, Wolfgang would need to go back to the drawing board and prepare his keyboard sonatas in such a way as to warrant their publication as sonatas with varied reprises. The work of Robert Levin and more recently that of Dorian Bandy have sensitized us to an improvisational impulse in Mozart's music. In this particular case, however, how much compositional revision might Mozart have had to do? How different would the score have looked, say, to any other Mozart keyboard sonata we know today? The clavier sonatas Leopold had in mind may well have been those Munich sonatas, which Wolfgang had indeed finished not long before. The new Köchel dates them between January 14th and March 5th, 1775. Mozart's crystal clear manuscript of them as a single batch is well known. He numbers the sonatas from 1 to 6. However, they were never published together, and certainly not as sonatas with varied reprises. In fact, Breitkopf responded negatively, citing a deplorable present state of the music business, and of the 6, only the 6th in D major was published during Mozart's lifetime in 1784 by Christoph Torricella in Vienna. The sonata in D stands out not just as the longest but most professionally performative of the 6, but also in regard to varying repeats. For this second movement, the Rondo en Polonaise, whose internal variations are entirely written out, and this Adagio cantabile variation from the last movement, which already in the manuscript Mozart prepared with embellishments. You can see how he at first, I'm gonna lower the lid of the piano for now because I can't see the screen myself. So I want to make sure that what I say is actually visible. So you see how at first he writes repeat signs And then he starts numbering the sections in order 1, 2, which is the embellished version of 1, 3, and 4, 4 being the embellished version of 3. If these instances of incorporating variation may well have given Leopold the idea of an entire opus of sonatas with varied reprises, then all other movements in the set would still need to be rewritten or rethought. Preparing such a publication as a counterfactual exercise, what if Breitkopf had accepted Leopold's offer, has been my project during the past 2 years, and I've treaded quite systematically. First studying C.P. Bach's Vodkan 50 in its own right, recording this opus on clavichord past April, then creating a new score with varied reprises of Mozart sonatas. Very recently, it's not even been 2 weeks ago, recording them on a Stein forte piano. I'd like to start with a little exercise focusing on performing the materiality of Bach's publication. And I'll play for you the opening movement of the set using the historical print. Meanwhile, you will follow along with a conventionalized score, one with regular repeat signs, which thus also omits the varied reprise. To contextualize such a performing versus listening experience, let us read the following crucial paragraph from Bach's preface. In the production of these sonatas, I've thought primarily of beginners and those amateurs who do not have the time or the patience to practice too much. I've wished to procure them the easy means to obtain the pleasure of being heard with variations without needing to invent these themselves or to ask others to write them for them and having to memorize them with lots of effort. Finally, I have expressed in the most explicit manner all that belongs to good delivery, so that one is able to play these pieces with complete freedom, even when one is not well disposed. Bach writes Verfertigung, which I translated as production rather than composition, trying to keep that hint at materiality. Bach also speaks of sich mit Veränderungen hören lassen, which seems like a crucial step removed from the practice of improvising. There's passiveness implied in to let oneself be heard with variations. To improvise, improvisieren is a term you'll not find in 18th century sources. Bach and his colleagues rather speak of spielen aus dem Stegreif, of the cuff playing, or fantasieren, to fantasize. One term we do find here is erfinden, to invent, in reference to inventio, or the first stage of the rhetorical process, which starts by inventing ideas, most commonly through fantasizing. Another rhetorical term is Vortrag, guter Vortrag, good delivery. And in this context, with remarkable clarity, it is to be understood as the proper reading of a well-prescribed score. Memoria, as the penultimate stage of the rhetorical process, is also referenced. It's the variations, so what's normally improvised, that are painstakingly memorized, auswendig gelernt. But that's an absurdity which Bach precisely sets out to address. However, the solution he offers, namely to provide the user with ready-made variations that must be read, is just as contradictory. Which brings us to Freiheit. In modern day Vortrag, memorizing is thought to lead to more and not less freedom. Here, on the contrary, it is the reading of a score that is assumed to free you up, regardless of your disposition. You don't have to feel or think, just play and read. Okay, I'm ready to play the movement. To widen the gap even more between you as kenner, listener, and me as that targeted beginner or amateur performer, I've added for you some key analytical terms from a sonata outline of Johann Nicolaus Forkel. Thanks. etc. Of course, you understood where the make-believe activity of veränderten started, since you had the advantage of a repeat sign. What I remember from my first reading sessions was that this point of "and now the variation is about to happen" was not at all clear. Not only did I miss in my score the visuals of those repeat signs, but also as I started performing these pieces for an audience, the deliberate act of a page turn in classical keyboard sonatas often coordinated with the first reprise or exposition. The end of a page at the first run means going back to the top. At the second run, turning the page signals both for myself and my listener that I'm about to embark on something new, namely the second reprise. This experimental score, on the contrary, postpones that turn of the page as long as possible. With no fewer than 6 staffs on the page, these 2 landscape pages look rather cramped. The flip side, however, is that already on this first verso and recto, you already see not only the entire first movement, but also the entire largo and the beginning of the final vivace. You're looking at 7 minutes of music right here. Strikingly, there are no double bars to separate the movements. Oops. Thus, loss of formatting clarity in this first sonata without repeat signs seems offset by the looks of a short, compact, and true composed sonata. However, if making things easy for the performer is the point of Bach's print, then paradoxically, the chosen format is also the one where the composer's persona shows most clearly, and where the performer, by lack of repeat signs, is forced to give up self-consciousness and control. Within most musical forms, repetition has remained unquestioned for a long time, but then anxiety began to be felt, a moment often identified with a quote by André Modeste Grétry, who expressed his exasperation in 1797. "A sonata is an oration. What would we think of a man who, cutting his discourse in half, were to repeat each half? I was at your house this morning. Yes, I was at your house this morning to talk to you about something, to talk to you about something." That's just about the effect that repeats in music have on me. This feeling was not particular to Paris. Johann Friedrich Reichardt, writing in Berlin in 1782, states, "As agreeable and necessary as repeats may be in music, and particularly repeats of some significant themes, as unnatural and senseless is that constant returning at the end, back the same way to where one started." Still, Grétry speaks of a sonata as an oration, discours, and in that rhetorical paradigm, repeats were not just tolerated, but considered essential. And the intriguing part here is that if the example had been less banal, Grétry might just as well have been advocating the value of repetition, as in, "I was at your house this morning." Yes, I was at your house this morning, etc. It all depends on your delivery. Writing 2 decades earlier, in 1777, Karl Ludwig Juncker asserted, "It is true that with a second repeat by einer zweiten Wiederholung, every musical impression is more enjoyable. Beauties can be too fleeting to be entirely understood and experienced with an unrepeated delivery." Vortrag. Note the seemingly pleonastic second repeat. Juncker's evocation of delivery, however, implies not just a repeat, but a varied repeat. The responsibility to never say the same thing the same way twice is represented in virtually all performance treatises in the mid-18th century. At the end of an entire chapter on variation, in which he demonstrates copious options to vary a simple musical idea, Quantz writes, "All these rules concerning variations have been aimed primarily at the adagio, because it is there that one has the most time and opportunity to vary, Zeit und Gelegenheit, zu verändern. Still, one will be able to use many of them also in the allegro. Rules concerning the allegro I leave to everyone's own thinking." Varying the allegro is what Quantz's younger colleague at the Berlin court, C.P.E. Bach, continued to explore. In the very last paragraph of his Versuch über die wahre Art, das Klavier zu spielen, he refers to one of his Probestücke as an example, ein Abriss, of how today one tends to vary the allegros with two reprises the second time around. Like Junker's Wiederholung that occurs a second time, Bach uses reprise to refer to that section of a sonata form, an allegro, that needs to be played twice. If reprise stands for a formal section, one half of a sonata movement, that must be repeated, then Sonaten mit veränderten Reprisen must be understood as an ellipsis, sonatas with varied repeats of the reprises. At stake for Bach was not the question of whether to repeat or not, but how to accommodate that practice of improvised variation onto the printed page. Along the way, as he found himself inventing a new genre, wondering to what extent performers, that is, non-composer performers, should even feel compelled to participate in such a practice. There are 9 varied reprise movements in Bach's opus, and these are the outer allegros, that is the first and third movements of the first, second, third, and fourth sonatas, as well as the first movement of the fifth. None of the slow middle movements have formal repeats, hence they also preclude additional embellishment and therefore, rather paradoxically, radiate a more relaxed atmosphere between the rather intense 2 outer movements. The tempo diminuetto, the third movement of the fifth sonata, while still holding affinity with the previous varied reprise structures, also transforms them from 4 sections, so including the repeats, to 8 accumulating but still highly interconnected sections with no formal repeats. The sixth sonata, although still called sonata, is in fact a single movement in double variation form C minor and C major on 2 protracted themes that themselves constitute a miniature binary varied repeat structure, each based on periods rather than reprises. In their regularity, they lend themselves superbly for improvisation by a free varying keyboardist repetition and variation developing in perfect sync. Bach wrote the fifth sonata first in 1758 in Zerbst, where he had retreated to escape war in Berlin. All the other sonatas were presumably composed back to back during the next year after his return to Berlin. So if the fifth sonata planted the seed for a whole opus, then the first sonata might well have been a proof of concept, as the first written with a new intent of producing an entire opus. And that first sonata does something that goes beyond the traditional context of performer taking over where the composer left it, which typically results in a symmetric varied reprise structure. So 1, 2, 3, 4 with 4 varying 2, with 2 varying 1 and 4 varying 3, but without compositional intent of connecting 2 and 3. Opening the opus, however, is a movement that precisely features such continuation. I've here bracketed iambic moments, short, long in the repeat of the first reprise, so section number 2. They add upbeat momentum to what we had in the first one. Also the left hand picks up the pace. This upbeat momentum and increased pace are continued as we go to the second half, or the second reprise, first run. In this movement, I never feel like I'm asked to retrace my steps, nor, for that matter, to turn back any page. It may be tempting to see such forward-leaning accumulation, or 1, 2, 3, and 4, as an essential feature of a new genre, one that transforms a practice into something different and better. However, most other reprise movements in the sets, and here you see a diagram of them, conform to the traditional symmetric model. Along this continuum between symmetric and successive, I've placed 3 movements that feature some diagonal connection in the middle, but they're still a minority. Moving away from a two-reprise structure altogether as some kind of climax are the two last movements on the right. I'd like to show you two excerpts of a video performance, if only to just show you the performance on clavichord, which would have been impractical in this room. In the first sonata, you'll see how we've aligned 4 static camera positions with each of the 4 reprises. You'll also see a close focus on my reading eyes scanning the score. But by the last sonata of the set, we've loosened that rigidity of a 4-fold structure, yielding to a free multi-camera approach. The initial activity of reading, intensely, but not quite in control of the musical narrative, merges with that of a fantasizing keyboardist, inventing and formulating his own musical thoughts, now unencumbered by the activity of reading. Tonally, and this is the last I'll say about Bach's opus, the keys of the 6 sonatas suggest a loop from F, G to G, A minor, D minor, B flat major to C minor major, especially after C major, the only next logical step is F. In other words, all the way back to the top, ready and empowered to read the first and the following sonatas again with new eyes and insight. One major issue when setting forth to apply Bach's experiments to Mozart's would-be opus is the sheer amount of material. Contrary to Bach, not just the allegros, but also the adagios are in sonata reprise form. Submitting all of these to the art of variation makes for a very, very long opus indeed. On the positive side, what has transpired through my project is the variety in my variations, dealing with 6 substantial pieces where compositional strategies are bound to recur and create what Ilan Sisman has called tertiary or intertextual rhetoric. I found myself applying also alternative varying strategies, gratefully not having to commit to specific ones. I mean, there's always another chance. I'd now like to share some examples with you before playing one entire sonata, the 4th in E flat. And I'll go to the Walter piano, which, by the way, has graciously been lent to us today by Michael Petchak. Okay. So first, an example of what not to vary. Oops, speak of materiality, pages. The stand is not wide enough. All right. In this C.P. Bach sonata, there's a figure in the left hand that kicks off every recurrence of the Hauptsatz, or main statement. It comes at the repeat. So these figures, one might say, act as little structural markers, as in, here's the Hauptsatz again. And I've applied that same principle to the first sonata of Mozart, where I've left the opening figure largely untouched. So my repeat. In the 2 first bars of the first movement of sonata number 4 of C.P. Bach, Bach creates an alternative version of the Hauptsatz through invertible counterpoint. So top becoming bottom and middle becoming top. While this creates quite a different tactile experience for the player, the oral result is almost the same. I do something similar in Mozart's F major sonata. The distinction between a symmetric, I should have given you those arrows. The distinction between a symmetric and a successive strategy becomes relevant in this slow movement of the third sonata. Thanks, Michael. In B flat major, Mozart uses triplets for the theme at the recapitulation. May this be read as a clue. I've applied Mozart's principle of diminution to the whole sequence of 1, 2, 3, and 4. Of the same sonata's first movement, there's this 2-bar opening theme, which has always struck me as some kind of a puzzle. It takes effort to come up with any options for variation, and it's to the extent that it's tempting to argue that it's best to just leave it alone. There are two opposing forces at work here. One is that triadic shape of the two harmonies, dominant and then tonic. And on the other hand, you have those 7/6 appoggiaturas. I always feel when I play the second version, I want to play the trill short to highlight the dissonance. Whereas if I want to go for the circularity of the triads, I try ideally to go for a long trill, which is actually extremely difficult to do. It's very hard to do smoothly. Now, I've always worked with the NMA edition, which gives for Mozart's theme twice the same version in the exposition and the recapitulation. How was my surprise when I found in the manuscript that the second time around, Mozart actually separates the dominant version into, and then back to. So it seems like that in decision which way to go, are we going to stress the appoggiaturas, or are we going to go for the triadness, is embedded in these two versions of Mozart. For my own 4 versions, I've played around with the two opposing directions. So I'll play 2, 3, and 4 and for now. Or arriving at Mozart's But then which one do we choose? The one separated or not? Now this brings me now to the first version, where I tap into the invention stage of fantasieren, and I went for a version that looks like a prelude to the whole thing. So at the top you see the NMA edition, and at the bottom you see my score. Etc. In case you start wondering about the Hauptsatz and the question whether it's something you may or may not touch, well, C.P. Bach clearly does, quite consistently so, for all the Hauptsätze in his opus. He keeps them either recognizable, as in the top example, or he gives them a different characterization altogether, as in the bottom example, which is an exception. Becomes. Sorry, I'll do that again. It's difficult to play with this mic in front of my face. For me, the question of whether to what extent one can change a Hauptsatz in Mozart came up especially in regard with the more catchy tunes of the finale movements. In the top example, I wasn't sure about doing anything at all. It's hard to top what's already there. But I decided to do something after all. So here I'm playing another version for the repeats, but I reversed the order of Mozart's and an alternative version. I mean, I should just say, yeah, in the F major sonata. What to do with the left hand? I'll give you two examples. One where I take away the Alberti bass. And here's one where I add the Alberti bass at repeat, and because of the momentum created, I run with it. Etc. I'll be playing it for you in its entirety in a minute. When it comes to performative bonuses like Eingänge, the embellishment of fermatas, cadenza, etc., I found myself quite naturally focusing on the final movements, where also in Mozart's manuscript one may observe increased integration of such improvisations as the opus proceeds. In the third movement of the B-flat sonata, he writes an Eingang, which he literally adds between two double bars. In the fifth sonata, we find this example. You don't really need it, so you could reserve it for the second time around. Or the example of this coda in the same movement. So here Mozart specifically keeps the coda, the two once more chords, for the repeat. Now, I could give a lot of examples to demonstrate these principles, but here's one, the last page of the first sonata. So what you see here, what I'm circling here, are things that I've added. So Mozart in the first run stopped here. Stopped here, but you can go all the way to the bottom and then so now I've played the other edition. Here I build in a timeout on the subdominant just before the structural cadence. And then we have those two final chords, which Mozart writes, but which the first time around I decided to omit, keep them for last, as he does himself in the G major sonata. Here is an example of how this whole exercise brought me back to the manuscript and made me see things that are not necessarily represented in modern editions. What you see at the top is a scale figure, an improvisation, where there are two slurs, which the anime ignores and turns into a single slur. Now, as a keyboardist, I understand what Mozart means. So if you have one slur, come on. If you have one slur, you finger it as an A major, regular A major scale. If you follow Mozart's slur, you put your thumb on the E, and you anticipate the high E at the top. I stress this point because it seems like when you put yourself on par with Mozart looking for variations, you need to have that keyboardistic bond that leads you to recognize things like this. Another little thing in this example are the stemming, which of course modern editions just unify in a single direction. I mean, the stemming makes a lot of sense if you play on these kinds of instruments. It's more a chamber music-like texture that is conveyed in the left hand. And I say this well realizing that this particular Walter Forte piano is already too modern for the repertoire that I'm illustrating here. It'd be more appropriate to have it earlier by Gentenflügel or Stein piano. Okay, I'd like to share my method of keeping track of variants. So first, I wrote them in between staffs or in the margins, which is what Bach did in his own printed copy of his sonatas. Then I used my iPad and stylus, changing certain moments in the NMA score. A few times when I was about to perform them, I printed out these scores and then of course started scribbling in alterations with regular pencil again. The final stage was transcribing all this in MuseScore. As I then felt on familiar grounds again, performing off what looks like your regular commercial print, I realized I still needed the more specifically performative additions, the cadenzas and Eingänge that we mentioned. However, and this was a new experience, in sympathy with C.P. Bach, who warns about excess or exaggeration, I no longer felt a need to impose too much, having gone through that constantly creative, varying process already. And then there was the recording, which had been a faraway deadline that suddenly came too soon, forcing myself 1 week prior to finally practice properly or to apply those rules of guter Vortrag to my own text. Before, and in hindsight, this is quite striking, I never quite felt a need for interpretation, or to say the same differently, varying had absorbed all my creative energies, taking over from interpreting. Along similar lines, I felt quite self-conscious during the recording when my producer, who followed along with my score, took my invented material and my articulation marks just as seriously as Mozart's. So I'll now finally play for you the entire sonata, and true to our focus on reading, I'll project my score and ask Michael to flip. You can go to the next page. Thank you, thank you. Returning to Bach one final time, in two of his personal copies of the printed Wotkin 50, we find additional variants in his hand, and this is the image we saw before. In addition, a separate folder entitled Variants and Embellishments of Some of My Sonatas contains yet more variations on various loose leaflets, including this same A minor movement, now completely rewritten with the new embellishments. In 1776, the young Johann Friedrich Reichard visited Bach in Hamburg, and he relates the following. He, that is Bach, demonstrated to me his great diversity in ideas through variations on the most lovely naive final movement, Stück, from the third sonata of his 6 sonatas mit veränderten Reprisen. I think there were more than 30 variations that he played on it. What does Reichard mean? That this A minor finale movement itself encapsulated variations on some theme, say the 2 first bars. Much more plausibly, Reichard was referring to alterations from the printed text already on the first of the 2 pages. I'm counting 26 of them. And this may mean 3 things. First, that Bach was keen to impress his visitor. Second, that to some degree, he may well have prepared some of his improvised extras, which, if true, adds a personal meta level to the previous exercise of publishing his improvisations. Third, that Bach must have assumed and capitalized on the assumption that Reichard knew the original, which is sort of paradoxical because the original was already very much about constant variation. In a sense, Bach finds himself in the loop he has himself created, causing him to continue varying his own print. Yet, and this is a paradox, the fact that there is an original print becomes essential. Indeed, when the opportunity arose for a reprint in 1786, so 10 years later, Bach did not change a single note. The reprint is exactly the same as the original. All these post-publication variants, by the way, have been published in the C.P. Bach Complete Works. And I must thank Paul Cornelsen, who is present here, for urging me to take those post-publication variants seriously, to the extent that I've recorded a second CD, including the variants, the personal embellishments, especially of the slow movements, entering that loop, so to speak. And I'm offering it as a second CD, so including all the movements that don't have variants as well, so we can listen to them as an opus again. Mozart, from his side, ended up not publishing his Munich sonatas. However, 3 years after composition, he still found them worthy enough to take with him as a portfolio on his German tour for various networking purposes, performing them himself, one at a time, or all 6 together, quite often by heart, he says, having them side-read by his distinguished colleague, such as Abbe Vogler, with Mozart accompanying on a second clavichord, etc. This is also when he met the piano builder Stein, enthusiastically proclaiming the Sonata XD as working incomparably well on his pianofortes. But if we look at the broader picture, it becomes clear that Mozart never quite invested in publishing keyboard sonatas. In any case, not like C.P. Bach or like Haydn. He was too busy with his operas and concertos. And it's in the latter that scholarship has mostly contemplated Mozart's improvisational practice. All in all, it may not be a coincidence we don't have any Mozart sonatas with varied reprises. And coming to the end of my own counterfactual project, I cannot but proclaim exhaustion. The immensely long opus I've created feels somewhat of a monstrosity, at least doubling the page volume. My determination to vary everything, almost killing what should have remained an exquisitely spontaneous performance practice. By contrast, as a welcome respite among my self-imposed assignment, I gratefully accepted this one and only exception in Mozart's manuscript of not writing a repeat sign at the end of the second half of the first movement of the D major sonata, which, by the way, is also not copied in NMA. Also the last and already the longest of the set. Saving you from retracing your steps back to the development, this omission, quite curiously, anticipates by many years a trend that would take hold only by the beginning of the next century. Meanwhile, despite some following, C.P. Bach did not repeat his experiment during the following years. He did publish 2 continuation sets, but only 2 movements in those have repeats written out. One could argue that with his first set, Bach provided his buyers training wheels, so to speak, and encouraging them to start writing on their own. But one can also, well, imagine someone like Mozart getting bored with the idea of showing others how he would do it. Making notable exceptions for his sister or a few of his students. However, for him, purposefully not writing out certain passages in his newest piano concerto, keeping his improviser's mind sharp and fresh as he walked on stage to perform. And so we're back to what Richard Lanham once coined, Homo rhetoricus, the rhetorical man who goes through life reveling in style, including ever-continuing variation. André Modeste Grétry wanted to get rid of it, of repeats, but Bach's message on this page, which gives me a kick over and over, handwritten ink mingling with engraved ink, is loud and clear. Long live the varied repeats. Thank you. I believe there's time for questions.
This was great, thank you so much. I just want to ask if you also consider varying phrase structure. And what I mean by this is, for instance, having an extended phrase in the original text could prompt you to actually use the basic phrase first time around and then use the extended phrase second time around. And a nice example was in your minuet from the Mozart sonata. In the first minuet, you have the first reprise ended with an appendix, and then the second reprise actually plays with the appendix and extends it to a proper phrase. So you could potentially drop the appendix first time around, use a two-bar appendix second time around, then use the same appendix third time around, and then use the phrase the fourth time around. So what do you think about it?
That's great, I hear you. On a personal level, I felt like in my Haydn project, where I recorded all the keyboard music, I did too much of that. I mean, that's my own reflection about those years. But I'm glad you picked up on the example in the minuet. And the other aspect here is that I try to use C.P. Bach as a model. And there's only one instance where he expands the measure into two, the second time around, just to stretch the structural cadential moment at the end. So, off the top of my head, I have to think. I mean, apart from this minuet, I don't think I do anything of that sort. But because I didn't want it to become a too cleverly analytical exercise either. I mean, I wanted to stay true to that idea of just, the performer's practice of spontaneously improvising off a text. And therefore, of course, it's much easier to follow what's already there. But thank you, yeah. Yeah. There's a microphone.
My question is, you talked about Bach saying that his variations are intended for people who don't have time to practice. And so I wonder about your variations. Are they also appropriate for people who don't have time to practice? Or do you like the aspect of the piece?
That's a really good, well, thanks. I mean, that's a flattering question in a way, because I haven't given this, I mean, I'm sort of anticipating. I mean, the only thing I can say is this. I've become used in my recording projects to offer also a video component, because I find that visual element very important, as in the C.P. Bach. I think it's more actually telling than the recording itself, is to have the video performance and see the visuals. And for the first time since quite a while, I've decided not to do that for the Mozart project. And I decided that my score will be the equivalent of that visual component. But I haven't thought it through yet, meaning that probably what I'll end up doing is just make it available on a website for everybody to consult. But beyond that, I wouldn't want to have any arrogance to think that people might actually do something with that. I don't know. I guess I would be offering it as an example. And on this note, I should also mention that the project started 2 years ago, or 1.5 years ago. We invited 6 young pianists to come and work at the Orpheus Institute, and each of them played one of these Mozart sonatas. So I was able to already coach certain things to younger people, I mean, really good pianists. I mean, it never got to the extreme of what I'm doing here, but still, the seed is planted. And I mean, if it can change, I mean, this is, I think, an important point I want to make, is that it has driven us away, it has moved us away from the question of what do we perform, more to who do we perform, who do we decide to be in that social structure of, you know, who these texts were meant for. And, but again, it borders on arrogance if I want to say, well, this is a worthwhile alternative, or it has any value as a counterfactual exercise, it's something that Mozart might have. I would never dare say that. I would rather say I'm acting as one of his potential colleagues. I'm trying to sit next to him and step out of that receiving mode that we so strongly feel in the C.P. Bach set. Though, as I explained also there, you get out of it by the loop. You get stronger and stronger as you go through the six. So I don't know yet. I mean, very pragmatically, I don't know what will end up with the score. And I mean, is there even a market for such a thing? It's hard to know.
Thank you so much. This is Evan Gilbert. A few years ago, I looked at a manuscript from a performance I did where my teacher wrote out ornaments for a 17th-century opera thing, and he'd asked me to write some out. And I looked at them, and I was struck at how much they were beautiful, but they were very 1984. And I was thinking about what it would look like if I had 20 of you in a different room that weren't exactly the same room, that had all the information. How many different possibilities would you come out with? So my next question would be, what would you come out with 10 years from now, 20 years, 30, 40 years? I know you can't answer that question, but no. I'm waiting now.
No, yeah, no, but that's extremely interesting. And maybe we should do the exercise again, as we did with these 6 students. Maybe we should, I mean, students, some of them were quite professional already, but maybe we should do it again. And create our own loop of ever-continuing variation and allowing more and more personalities to enter the playground. Elaine? Yeah.
Thank you for this extraordinary demonstration. I found it actually visually exhausting without the repeat signs. And it made me realize how little there is to demarcate. You're following along tonally, you know you're just sort of closing segment, and then there's no really
Yes.
quarter rest or something. There's nothing that, and I wondered if you would not vary the first, say, 4 measures of the reprise, so that there would be a little kind of calm moment that you could take in. Here's the repeat, and now I'm going to hear the variations, because there's so many pieces where, thinking of high sonatas, that I come up with a single example, but the first 4 measures, or even sometimes the first 5 measures in a rondo are not varied. But then the repeat of that is varied, or the continuation is varied. And it just gives you a little respite, whether visual or auditory, so you can process, here it is coming around again, before then you become much more elaborate, instead of being completely continuous process.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm trying to think what I did that would have provoked that reaction.
No, what you did was great.
No, but listen. I mean, this exercise puts you in constant doubt about what you do, and there's always going to be another opinion. And before you know it, you feel like, okay, I can't do anything anymore. It's yeah. But on the other hand, then you are really signaling the exercise. Huh? I mean, then you're sort of taking that step away from, okay, I'm now going to engage in a practice. But I don't know what I'm trying to say here. I mean, I pointed out the fact that in C.P. Bach's case, it's clear that he immediately starts embellishing. That's clear.
But some of his opening themes are simpler than Mozart's.
But this is the question, Hilton. I'm not sure. I mean, I have sat down I've done this so many times over the past year or two, where I just, I go for another session at night and I'm alone at Orpheus, and, and I try again. And especially with those themes, with those pieces that we've practiced and heard over and over and over again, it's really, really hard to decide, okay, now I'm gonna just lay it aside and I'm gonna do something completely different. That's what I did with that. The breakthrough that I had there was actually by looking at the Sonata-form line with Varied Reprises, where I realized that his 2 versions of the theme were not all that great. I mean, I wouldn't know which one of the 2 I would prefer. So I thought, okay, I can take a liberty to once do something that may be not at the height of a Mozart. And it's more important that I try and do something different. I mean, that example to me, I mean, what I don't know if this is the example that you have in mind, but if you start tapping into that, we have to recognize it, then before you know it, there's no room to go anymore. That's what I felt. So you have to dare and take it head on at the beginning. But I don't know. So this is what I mean with removing ourselves. We are putting ourselves we are adopting a critical stance to what we do because of everything that we've known, and we know how Mozart sonatas are supposed to be, etc., etc. But it doesn't conform with the practice. If you look at sonatas of Löhlein, of C.P. Bach, there's Hessler as well. It doesn't. And is that a step that we are willing to take?
Hi there, thank you. This was awesome. Your imbrication of yourself with the composer reminded me a lot of literary scholar Jeff Goldman's very playful sense of style as a way of becoming. So as struck when you mentioned the stylus of your iPod, for example, and the relationship between stylus and style. And I'm looking at this manuscript here, it's really thoughtful, and you can see the stylus on the page, right? All of these extra things. So I'm just wondering if you can talk about this project.
Well, yeah, thank you. The materiality side of it was eye-opening for me, literally. I mean, it's all about reading the material, but then if you take a creative role, you are changing texts constantly, and it drives you nuts because you never know when to stop or when to start over. It's a material nightmare, especially for someone my age, where I don't have the skill to do music score myself, so I had an assistant, I had somebody help me, and that creates dialogue, which is also in itself very interesting. So it's been this combination of old style materiality and new style materiality, and to finally come to that moment where you say, okay, now enough, no more discussions. This is it. This is what we're going to record next week. In itself is very important because it replicates this sense of a deadline. You know, I mean, it would have been the same for Mozart or whoever. You know, they need to meet the deadline and get the score in with the publisher. So those aspects have been eye-opening to me, yes. And it kind of, and that's what I try to encapsulate with the idea, there's always another chance. I don't have to get it right now, and I meant in this sonata because I'll have another chance later. If not with this opus, then there's still gonna be another chance if I adopt that lifestyle, which of course I'm not gonna, I mean, I'm not so obsessive with this, but it's nice to entertain that thought about how musicians live their lives. I don't know whether that answers your question, but absolutely the materiality is so essential. The other part of this is now also because I'm getting older. My eyes don't function the way they used to, so that sort of also triggered these questions of reading and what is involved when you read something, and all of a sudden you feel like you don't. I mean, the same as what you were hinting at, Elaine, I suppose, is that you don't recognize, you don't follow the same analytical instincts that you have when you perform from a more regular text as we used to. And then there's of course that performative aspect of dealing with page turns, which Bach seems to sort of want to obliterate. It's not relevant to the performance, which is a very modern idea, of course, because that's what we all try to do. We try to ignore the page turns, whereas when you embody 18th century performance practice, this is one of the things you must do. You must embrace those moments where you have the page turn. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think I'm my own chair here, so I think we've exhausted our time. Thank you very much.